The time start.
Good evening and welcome all. I, Doipan Mitro, welcome you to this online lecture series. Today is the lecture number 8 that is especially organized on the topic partition literature. And today we have got a special guest, Sheikh Tarik Ali, Assistant Professor of English at Government General Degree College, Mohanpur. Uh, Professor Ali will deliver an extensive lecture on the broad spectrum of issues related to the partition literature. When we use the word partition, it is connotative of a number of signifiers, as we can see, because the partition resulted in the separation not only of a kind of geographical space, but also in the separation of a shared culture, shared history, shared identity, and millions of Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, they were uprooted from their homeland and rerouted in an alien landscape. So the text which we have got in the 6th semester syllabus of VU, they actually include some novels, some poem, as well as some short stories related to the trauma of partition, because such texts try to point out the arbitrariness of the notion of drawing borders. A text like, for example, Toba actually raises the question that basically tells that the entire world is a kind of macrocosmic kind of lunatic asylum, and that is a kind of through a miniature depiction of a kind of cell we get a kind of idea of what is happening across the country. Or a text like Abar Ashibo Fire, written by Jibanananda Das, I shall return to this Bengal, epitomize the kind of unsullied and sacrosanct essence of Bengal before the trauma of partition came. Uh, Professor Tarik Ali will explore the different texts which are part of our syllabus, of our 6M syllabus, and will give you or give us kind of broader issues, broader ideas in respect to the partition literature, how we can approach those partition texts, what kind of methodology we can approach, and what are the kind of aftermath of such a kind of trauma. I would request our YC sir, Professor Bishesha Chakraborty, to deliver the inaugural lecture for today's online lecture series and introduce our speaker.
So, good evening, all, and I welcome you all heartily who have joined so far to this lecture. Today, we will have a talk on partition literature, focusing on the texts there are in the syllabus, but it will cover other areas too, I think, because Tarik Ali, who is an assistant professor of English, currently posted at Mohanpur General Degree College, Government General Degree College, has read and worked extensively on it. So we will expect that there will be he will be focusing on the partition from a multi-dimensional angle, because partition itself is something which is multi-dimensional and multi-layered, though it was basically a partition, geographical partition along the religious lines, but there are other factors too, and there has been a very crude politics behind that. Now, Tarik is a very dynamic student of literature, as I know, and he has published extensively on various issues. Besides being well versed in partition literature and partition related issues, he also is very much well versed in environmentalism literature, and he has published many papers in different journals, as well as he has spoken in many delivered talks in many seminars and symposiums. So I would request Rahul to formally introduce me and before our students and the participants who have graced us, and I formally inaugurate this. So I would request Rahul Bodua, our head of the department, to make some observation on today's
Thank you,
topic
sir.
as well as the speaker.
Thank you, sir. And this is uh, another day of our lecture series. And we have among us Professor Tarik Ali, and he will be delivering his lecture on partition literature. Presently, Professor Ali is posted in Government General Degree College, Mohanpur, and he has published in different national and international journals. And as our YC sir had mentioned, that he has also uh, shared his views in different talks. And I would request Professor Tariq Ali to start his lecture on partition literature. Welcome, sir, to our lecture series.
Okay, hello and good evening.
Good evening,
Uh,
Tarik. Good evening.
first of all, I thank Visesar sir for giving me the opportunity to share some of my thoughts on partisan literature and particularly on the texts that are in the syllabus of sixth semester UG of Vidyasagar University. But before I start, there is one disclaimer. Uh, this this is a class, not a sort of lecture, and my presentation is aimed primarily at students, more particularly at the students of the semester 6 of our university, that is Vidyasagar University. So if you are looking for something very profound and scholarly on partisan literature, this is the wrong place to look for such things. Okay, with this disclaimer, let me give you the outline of my lecture. Before I enter discussing the particular text, I would be focusing on partisan literature, more particularly on why should we read partisan literature. Okay, then I'll be moving to the individual texts that are in our syllabus. And one thing that I want to mention here is that I'm not going to deal with Amitabh Ghosh's The Shadow Lines, because uh, there has already been a lecture on Amitabh Ghosh's Shadow Lines last week. So, other than Amitabh Ghosh's Shadow Lines, the four texts that are in the syllabus, I will be dealing with them individually. Okay. So before I take the text for the analysis for, I mean, looking into the representation of the partisan reality, let me start with the necessity of partisan literature. I mean, of reading and studying partisan literature. Why should we read partisan literature? Partition, as we know, it is one of the most cataclysmic events in the history of Indian subcontinent, in particular in the history of South Asia and in the history of the world as a whole. uh, Disorder, death, disaster, uh, distress. Uh, I mean, uh, accompany this disturbing incident in the history of the country. But and we all are aware of the history of partition because we have been informed about this partition of India that accompanied the celebrated freedom of the country. But unfortunately, in the official history of the country, we only get a sort of biased and incomplete picture of this unfortunate event. Okay. So literature, I mean, partisan literature looks beyond the historical record that is available in the archive or history of the country. Okay, the official history of the country, I mean. Because there is, in fact, an abundance of political histories of the partition. But this abundance of political histories is equaled by a sort of paucity of social histories of it. Okay? And in the form of historical record of this mayhem, of this catastrophic violence, we have some abstract, we have some objective, empirical data on the partition reality. Okay? Because the dominant hegemonic structures of public memory, okay, have never spoken about the personal sufferings, how the individuals suffered, individuals of both the religion, I mean Hindu and Muslims, how the women suffered, how the children suffered, how people belonging to the lower strata, they suffered. Okay, in the official history of the country, in the nationalist records of the country, what we have is a sort of abstract, empirical, and objective data on partition reality. Okay? And even in some of the national historical accounts of this terrible vivisection of India, uh, there is no mention of how freedom had come, freedom of the India come accompanied by murder, mayhem, displacement, abduction of women, rape of women, and such things. So on the one hand, we have this homogeneous nationalist discourse that exclusively concentrate on the high politics of the partition. Okay, on the one hand, we have this abstract empirical data on partition. Okay, thousands of people died, thousands of women were raped and abducted, thousands of houses were looted. We have only this data, we have only this, I mean, a sort of what I say, it's a sort of, I mean, a particular kind of information about partition. Okay, even in some case, in some of the historical description, we have a sort of sensationalist description of this unfortunate event. Okay, but in this rhetoric, I mean, this homogeneous rhetoric of nationalist representation of partition, what we miss is the plurality of experiences, the multiplicity of experiences of partition. Because partition was not a sort of homogeneous experience for different class and kind of people. Women suffered during the partition differently from men. Lower caste people suffered differently from upper caste people. Lower class people suffered differently from the upper class people. Even the children suffered differently from the adult people. So there is the multiplicity of experiences that is involved in the partition reality. But what we have in partition history, in the historical record, in the official nationalist historical records of partition, it is sort of homogeneous description of the horror of partition. Okay, and that too represented in a sort of incomplete and biased form. So as Doipayan Babu has mentioned, that partition resulted not only in the division of the geographical space, but also of the shared history, of shared culture, of language, of memories. I mean the cultural, the markers of culture that were also divided, the markers of culture between the communities that were also divided with the geographical division of the Indian subcontinent of the land. Okay, so the historical record of partition, in a sense, is I mean, it is merely some data on the realities of partition. Okay, that too represented in some cases in sensational ways. But where are the other voices? I mean, beyond this homogeneous narrative of partition? Where are the other voices? Beyond this political, high politics of the partition, beyond the representations of the political reality, where are the narratives of individual suffering? Where are the representation of how women suffered? Where are the representation of how the poor people suffered differently from the rich people? That is where the partisan literature comes into significance, because partisan literature tells the stories of individual suffering. Okay, beyond the official, formal, nationalized rhetoric of the partition, partisan literature, partisan studies explores the hidden and diffuse narratives of this unfortunate catastrophic event. Okay, partition literature explores the human cost of the partition. Human cost means how different kinds of people experience the partition differently, how different communities of people experience the partition differently, how people belonging to particular, I mean, different places, they experience the partition suffering differently. This multiplicity of human experiences involved in the displacement induced by partition, involved in the homelessness induced by the partition, involved in the exploitation, I mean, both the physical exploitation, the sexual exploitation, implicated in the partition reality, all these have been explored by partition literature. Okay? So, partition literature is a sort of alternative history because it challenges the official record. Partisan literature is a site of resistance. Resistance to what? Resistance to the official record, the official data on partition that is recorded in the archive of the state. So, on the one hand, partisan literature challenges the hegemonic narratives of identity, power, and belonging, on the one hand. On the other hand, it tells the, I mean, it represents the alternative voices and alternative realities. Okay? So, partisan literature, it's a kind of resurgence. Resurgence of what? Resurgence of the hidden, suppressed histories. Histories that are not there in the official records of the state. Histories that are beyond this official data. Histories that destabilize and challenge the official ones. Okay? Because the official history that we have in the form of partisan history, that I am repeating again, that is incomplete, that is biased, and that is there. That is appropriated by the needs of the state. Okay, so that is where partisan literature comes into significance, because it tells us the personal stories of suffering, how a particular woman suffered, how a particular Dalit suffered, okay, how a particular low class man or woman suffered, how a child suffered. These individual stories of partition, okay, that are there in the partition narratives. Okay, not only in partition literature, but also in the cultural representation of partition. I mean the partition cinema as well. Okay, so this, on the one hand, we have this abundance of political histories of partition, that is the official historical record of partition. On the other hand, we had this paucity of the individual experiences. And partition literature, they filled in this gap by exploring the personal stories of partition. Okay, so this is a sort of alternative history. This is a sort of destabilizing, challenging, contesting the official rhetoricized history of the nations. I mean, both the nations. Okay, and in this context, I would like to mention two partition critics. They are very famous, and one of them died very last year. One is Ritu Menon and Kamla Vasin. Okay, in their books, that is Borders and Boundaries, they pointed out the necessity of partisan literature by pointing to the incompleteness of the official history of partition. Okay, according to them, in the official formalized standard history of partition of the nations, of both the nations, there is a worrying absence of feminist historiography. There is worrying absence of the sufferings of the low class people. Okay, and they pointed out the need of reviving these stories of this women, who suffered terribly. Women were abducted, raped. There are many narratives of women suffering, in partisan literature. So Riti Menon and Kamla Vasin, they repeatedly emphasize the need to look beyond the official history if we want to get a complete picture of partition reality. In addition to Ritu Menon and Kamla Vasin, Urvasi Butalia, another critique on another recognized, internationally renowned voice on partition literature, she added to what Menon and Vasin argued, and in her book, The Other Side of Silence, uh, uh, where she retrieved through interviews and oral narratives the stories of the smaller, invisible player of the unfortunate events, that is, women, children, and scheduled caste. Urvasi Bitalia time and again emphasize the need to look beyond the official history of the petition to get a complete understanding of the unfortunate events. Okay, not only Menon, Vasin, and Butalia, Tanika Sarkar as well. She also speaks about looking beyond the official record to get to know the reality of the petition. Okay, so partisan literature, partisan studies as a whole, it first of all challenges the official record, and secondly, it shows, it represents the need of knowing about the personal history or personal stories of partition. Okay, and in partition literature, partition literature is nothing but a mixture of three things. One is the memory of the characters that are there in a literary text, or a cinema, or a movie, or a cultural text. One is memory. The second one is history, and third one is imagination. Okay, memory, that is the nostalgia. I would be discussing this idea of memory, as a trope in partition literature, when I will be discussing the story Alamson's Own House. So partition literature is nothing but an amalgam of these three things. That is the memory of partition, memory of individuals' memory about partition. Okay, in Shadow Lines, the students, you have already a class on Shadow Lines. You can understand that how much significant role, how significant role a memory plays in any partition text. So one is memory, second one history, but not the official history. A slice of historical details have been taken, and they are included in a sort of refined form in partition text. And imagination. Okay, in a partition text, we have these three things, and these three things, they together produce an imaginative space. Okay, that is important. That is necessary for understanding the partition reality. Okay. Now, storytelling has a very significant role to play in communicating any problem of the society. Okay, when I was doing some work on the idea of novel and the representation of novel in representation of climate change in novel, I found that the ethical and the symbolic side of storytelling, they played a major role in communicating the realities of climate change. In case of partition literature, the same argument is applicable because the ethical and the symbolic side of storytelling, okay, they are in fact fundamental in communicating the horrors of partition to the readers. Because the partition critics, they alike agree that the literary conventions, literary, element devices like symbols, like images, like tropes, like forms, and many other aesthetic dimensions, they help in laying out the horrors of partition. They help in laying out the violence of the partition in the form of stories. Okay, so that, this is where a partition story is important because its symbolic side, the literary conventions, the forms, the aesthetic dimensions, they altogether create an ambience, that involve the reader within its fabric, and help the reader to understand the reality of partition. Okay, I mean, we can never deny the fact that the representation of individual experiences of the horrors and violence in imaginative literatures, it I mean it renders the impersonal and empirical data on the crisis perceptible to human mind. Okay, because there is some official record, okay, there is some official data, but we can never relate to that official data. We can have some information that hundreds of people died, hundreds of houses were looted, but when we read a story of an individual, how he or she suffered, we can relate ourselves to the suffering of that particular individual. That is where the individual experiences are important. That is where imaginative literature comes into force, because the impersonal objective statistics, the data on the crisis, we cannot relate ourselves to them. We can relate to them only after we read about them, we see their suffering on the screen, and it becomes easier for us to relate. That is where the affect comes into being, the emotions. Okay, because it becomes very easier, okay, to relate ourselves to the suffering of that individual. Okay, and that is where the significance of story comes into play. Okay, so I'm telling about the significance of storytelling in communicating the horrors of partition. So on the number one is the aesthetic dimensions. The literary conventions, how they play a major role, a big role in laying out the partition's horror in the form of stories. Secondly, I told about the individual experiences of the horrors and how they make it easy for the readers, to communicate themselves, to communicate the partition horrors. And the third thing that I would like to point out is the idea of slow violence. Okay, because there was a partition incident. The partition event was not an immediate catastrophic violence only. Okay, it is not an immediate catastrophic violence only. It is, if I quote Aisa Jalal has told that partition is a defining movement that has neither a beginning and nor an end. That is called the long partition by Wazira Jaminder. Okay, so what is slow violence? There was a sort of immediate violence. People suffered. Their houses were looted, plundered. Women were raped. There was a kind of, they had to leave their house. They become homeless. They suffered as refugees. There were some immediate catastrophic violence, immediate effects, after effects of the partition. But there is also a long-standing, incremental kind of violence. Even now, people who lost their home on the either side of the borders, they are suffering from the trauma of homelessness. That is where, that is why Isa Jalal, has observed that it is a defining moment that has neither a beginning nor an end. So this slow, accretive, gradual, incremental violence that people are suffering even today. Partition happened long back in 1947, but there is, the communities of people who are still been suffering from the trauma of partition because of the memory of partition in them. So that is the slow violence. And this slow violence of partition, they cannot be informed by recording them in historical form. In history. Because slow violence always evades our imaginative capacities if they are not recorded in imaginative literature. Okay? History can never inform us that how people suffer gradually, incrementally, even today. Okay, it can only record the catastrophic, immediate consequences of the unfortunate event. But the slow, gradual, incremental, accretive, long-standing violence of partition, okay, the multiple forms of violence of partition, they can only be informed, they can only be, communicated by recording them in imaginative literature. Okay, so this is the third point where, where partition literature comes into play, where the partition storytelling, is significant, because the slow violence of partition, the long-standing after effects or the consequences of partition, they can never be communicated by recording them in history. So this is the third point. The next important thing about, why partition literature is significant and why we should look beyond partition history to know about the true realities of partition in complete form, is that history of partition only records the physical dimensions of partition. Okay, I'm repeating again: the suffering of the individual, the number of houses looted, the women raped and abducted and raped. They only, record the physical dimensions of partition. But the philosophical, the political, the social, and the cultural implications of partition, they can never be recorded in history. Okay, they can never be recorded in history. It is the partition literature, it is the imaginative literature on partition. Okay, it is the fictional imaginings regarding partition that can only give us a picture about the philosophical, political, social, and cultural implications of partition. Okay, so that is where I believe that, with all these reasons, given all these reasons, the literary conventions, the aesthetic dimension, number one, number two, the representation of individual experience, number three, the slow incremental violence of partition that otherwise evades our imaginative capacities, and the social, political, and cultural implications of partition beyond the physical dimensions of partition. Given all these points and arguments, my my understanding is that the problems of partition, that the horrors of partition, they can never be fully communicated without, with a thorough reading of history alone. Okay, rather a productive dialogue between imaginative literature and partition reality. It can only provide the insights, it can only provide the imaginative space that is necessary for understanding and imagining the partition crisis. Okay, so partition literature is significant in this way. Okay, it gives us gives us something other than the information of partition. Okay, it, enchants us to engage ourselves in the suffering, in the sufferings of the people who suffered during the partitions. Okay, and there are multiple forms, literary forms that have been used to explore this stories of partition, not the history, rather the stories of partitions. There are, there is partition fiction, the partition novel, there is partition stories, the short stories, there is partition cinema. Okay, there is even partition uh, documentaries, not fictional completely. There are multiple cultural literary forms that have been used to look into the horror of partition in imaginative form. Okay, now, if I start naming the writers who have written about partition in the form of narrative fiction, then I can. I'm giving you three or four names who that are familiar to you. To start with, Khuswant Singh, he's trained to Pakistan. There is another novelist whose name is Chaman Nahal. He's Azadi. Then Ismat Chugtai, who is one of my favorites, her Lifting the Veil. Then there is Salman Rushdie, Midnight Children, Anita Desai, whose Clear Light of Day. Partly at least there is the reference or the mention of partition. Then Bapsi Sidhu's Ice Candy Man, which is a very riveting narrative of partition as well as delightful. Number of Atia Hussein's Sunlight on a Broken Column. Numbers of novelists are there who have recorded sometimes their own or sometimes the experiences of some other characters in the form of narrative fiction. All right. Now, if we come to the shorter version of novel, shorter version of narrative fiction, that is the short stories, then I can give you the name of Sadat Hasan Manto, Pustabatek Singh. I'm going to discuss, not in detail, but at least in some sort of concise manner. Then there is Amrita Pritam, whose short story Pinja is one of my favorites. Then there is Intijar Hossain. Bisam Sahani. There are a number of writers who have explored the partition experiences in the form of short stories. In addition to this literary fiction written on the theme of partition, written on the sufferings and problems of partition, there are some cinema and some movies, feature films in particular, not the documentary I'm referring to, feature films that have, where we have the cinematic expression of cinematic representation of partition. Okay, in those movies, we have on the screen the not the dialogic or not the recorded form, rather we have some screen in the moving representation of the partition reality. And some of the movies produced from the Bollywood film industry are Hey Ram is one movie, Earth, where Amir Khan, which is Amir Khan's starrer film. Okay, Gadarak Prem Katha. Then Garam Hawa is one of the fine piece of cinema on partition literature. So there, partition movies, there are multiple literary and cultural forms where we have the representation of partition. Where we have rather the individual stories of partition, the personal stories of partitions. Okay, and most of these stories, I must mention here that most of these stories adhere to a basic narrative pattern. Okay, most of the stories that is there in novels or in short stories or in cinema, most of them follow a basic narrative pattern. That is the narrative format of order, disorder, and order again. Okay, there was some order before the partition. People were living happily and harmoniously before the vivisection of the country. Before the vivisection of the country across the border. Across the religious lines. So there was some order. Then the disorder came when the religious fanaticism, and people started killing and abducting women. Okay, people of both the religions, when they started there was some sort of religious fundamentalism. So there come the disorder, and finally the order is again established. Okay, and in this context, I must also mention that most of the writers, in fact all of them, they take a sort of secular and humanist view of partition. Okay, On the one hand, they criticize and condemn the politics of partition, the politics of division on the one hand. On the other hand, they celebrate the humanism, they celebrate the multiculturalism. Okay, they celebrate the multicultural essence of the idea of India. Okay, multicultural essence, and they always speak about looking beyond the ethnic identity, looking beyond the religious identity, and to look humans as human, not on the basis of their religious identity. So most of this text, partition text, follows this particular line of representations. Okay, the order, disorder, order. I mean narrative design, and the humanist view. Uh, if we take, for example, Khuswant Singh Chain to Pakistan, here, I mean, there we see how it was Jagga whose sacrifice ultimately brought some sort of, establishes some sort of the celebration of humanism in the village of Manomajra, in adjoining areas, and in the country as a whole. So this celebration of the secular, humanist, multicultural idea of the nation, okay, that is placed in antithesis to the religious fundamentalism, when people become mad and they started killing each other and even killing their neighbors without thinking about that they were their brothers, I mean the day before, or the weeks before. Okay, so literature, I mean the literature of partition, I mean the partition literature, that includes to some extent the border studies, that include to some extent the conflict studies, history. Okay, that is an amalgam of all these things. They explore, they represent the individual stories of partition. Okay, uh, in some cases in an entertaining way, I must tell, because if we read Topatek Singh, we find how the nonsensical gibberish of the madmen, the lunatics, produce some sort of humor in the story. Okay, so partition literature, I mean, as a whole, look beyond this historical official record of the partition, and they use the literary aesthetic dimension, that is the symbol, tropes, and other literary conventions, to represent the individual stories of partition, to communicate to us the slow violence of partition, and to give us an idea about the philosophical, social, and cultural implications of the partition. Okay, that is a sort of brief introduction to why we should read, why should we read, why should we study partition literature. Now, if you have any question, you can ask without any hesitation, and then I would move to the next part of my lecture, that is the discussion of the individual texts that are there in your syllabus. Any question or queries?
Okay, students, you can ask questions to.
Yes, students, you can ask.
Yeah, whatever is in your
Yes,
mind, you can ask. Okay, because sir has very categorically laid out the way the partition literature is constructed, and partition has been constructed in literature as well as in culture, and he has very uh, briefly and concisely pointed out the various aspects why we should study partition literature. So if you have any question or anything that makes you curious from his lecture, you must ask him some the questions. So anybody, if you have any kind of curiosity,
Any kind of question, any kind of query,
you can query, and you can speak in Bengali
Yes.
as well, because sir has been.
you can speak in Bengali as well. হ্যাঁ, বাংলায় বলতে পারো। পার্টিশন
Yeah.
নিয়ে বাংলাতেও অনেক লেখালেখি আছে।
Yes.
Does imaginative literature add any value to partition literature, or it distorts them?
Yeah.
Distorts them. It is not a sort of distortion, because in imaginative literature there must be some imaginative elements. We can never call them the distortions, because I told you that it is partition literature is merely a mixture of three things: the memory of individuals, the historical record to some extent, and imagination. Okay, now if imagination is distortion, then every literature is distorted text. Okay, so it is not a distortion, rather it is a sort of, uh, refined, it is a sort of improvised representation of the partition reality with the addition of imaginative elements into it. Okay. Anybody, anything else?
So you can post your question in the chat box
যদি
and
যদি ইংরেজিতে অসুবিধা হয় বাংলাতেও প্রশ্ন করতে পারো। পার্টিশন নিয়ে বাংলা, ইনফ্যাক্ট আমরা যে গল্পগুলো পড়বো তার মধ্যে বা গল্প বা কবিতা তার তো বাংলাতেই লেখা। দিবেন্দু কলেজের ছোট গল্পটি বাংলায় লেখা, জীবনানন্দ দাশের কবিতাও আবার আসিবে ফিরে বাংলায় লেখা। বাংলাতে প্রশ্ন করতেই পারো। মানিক বন্দ্যোপাধ্যায়ের ইনফ্যাক্ট 4টার মধ্যে 3টে টেক্সটই তো বাংলাতেই লেখা। বাংলাতেও প্রচুর কাজ আছে পার্টিশন নিয়ে। ঠিক আছে, যদি প্রশ্ন থাকে শেষে করো তাহলে। আপাতত লেট মি মুভ টু দ্য ফার্স্ট টেক্সট, দ্যাট ইজ আলমস ওন হাউস। Alam's Own House, that is written by Dibendu Palit. Okay. This is a story. আমি যদি স্যার আমি একটু বাংলাই বলবো কি?
একদমই obviously
আমি যদি যদি স্টুডেন্টদের জন্য বলছি, আমি যদি পার্টিশন লিটারেচারের বিষয়বস্তুগুলো মানে থিম বিষয়বস্তুগতভাবে পার্টিশন লিটারেচারকে দেখি, তাহলে কিছু নির্দিষ্ট বিষয়বস্তু আমরা পার্টিশন লিটারেচারের মধ্যে খুঁজে পাই, পার্টিশন সাহিত্যের মধ্যে। যেমন ধরে নাও ডিসপ্লেসমেন্ট, হোমলেসনেস, বিলঙ্গিং, এটা একটা বিষয়বস্তু যেটা আমরা অনেক পার্টিশন সাহিত্যের মধ্যে খুঁজে পাই। যেমন ধরে নাও সেক্সুয়াল ভায়োলেন্স, এক্সপ্লয়টেশন অফ উইমেন, সেটা একটা থিম যেটা আমরা অনেক পার্টিশন টেক্সটের মধ্যে খুঁজে পাই। যেমন ধরে নাও migration and refugee crisis, that is also involved in the partition reality, because people of both the religion, they have to cross the border because of the religious fanaticism in their homeland. So এই যে migration and refugee crisis, এটাও কিন্তু একটা theme of one of the themes in partition literature. So আমি যদি গল্প আর একটা থিম হচ্ছে the psychological aspects of partition. Okay, the trauma of partition, we can call it. So if we categorize the stories in our syllabus according to these concerns and themes in partition literature, then the first story, Alam's Own House, it is about the theme of home, belonging, displacement and identity crisis. Okay, home, belonging, displacement and identity crisis. At the outset, I must tell you that in the story Alam's Own House, there are 4 human characters. Alam, okay, who is the protagonist apparently, Anantasekhar, okay, the present owner of the house, Sneha, the wife of Anantasekhar, and Raka, Alam's beloved and the daughter of Anantasekhar and Sneha. They are the human characters present in the story, and there is the reference to Alam's father, okay, the doctor father. But importantly, they are not, none of them is the protagonist in the story. The central protagonist in the story is the house. Okay, the house that is mentioned in the title. Okay, in case of Kuswant Singh, it was Manu Majra, the village, which was the central protagonist. So here the house is the central protagonist, because the house, it is the house that metaphorically foregrounds the crisis that Alam experiences due to his feeling of displacement there in his own house. Okay, because and one thing that I must mention here is that we usually we see, if we read the history of partition, that partition exhibits its ravages in terms of the mass massacre, in terms of mass displacement. Okay, but what about an individual? What about an individual like Alam? Okay, how, I mean, he experienced his homelessness, how he experienced when he became homeless in his own house, how he experienced the change, the transformation that occurred, particularly after the partition of the two nations. Okay, so this story, in fact, shows the dystopia that is involved in the possibilities of reconciliation with home, because when the story starts, in fact, Alam was living in Bangladesh. Okay. And he made a journey to India, I mean to Kolkata in particular, uh, for a reconciliation conference. Reconciliation conference means a conference on the reconciliation between the two countries. I mean, Bangladesh was East Pakistan then. Okay, East Pakistan then. So it was, I mean, his journey was primarily directed to the purpose of reconciliation between the two countries. Okay, but at the end he found that this reconciliation is only a myth. Okay, because it was the religious affiliations which were the primary consideration that determined everything. I mean, during the partition, that determined where people will live in, whom people will love. Okay, even their love, the very personal thing, was decided by this religious affiliation, this political reality. I mean, there is a conflict between the personal and the political in the story, because we see that ultimately the genuine sincere love of I mean Alam for Raka, it ended in incompleteness. Okay, because of the political reality, because of the political conflict. Okay, so on the one hand we have this personal space of romance, because Alam cherished his conversation with Raka. I mean, they when they exchanged letters for very long time. Okay, and the house that Alam revisited, in fact, it was a house originally belonging to Alam, because it was a house that was constructed by his own father. And Anantasekhar, he was usually a man from Pakistan. Okay, before the partition. Now, when the partition crisis started, and when there was religious fanaticism, they decided to exchange their houses. So Alam's own house ultimately, after the partition, became the house of the Anantasekhar, becomes the house of Anantasekhar and Sneha. Okay, and Raka as well. So when Alam returned to the house after and Alam ultimately, initially he stayed at the house even after the exchange of the houses, because he had to complete his study at Kolkata. Okay, and there a friendship, a kind of infatuation grew in Alam for Raka. It was more than a friendship. Okay, and ultimately Alam had to get back to Bangladesh soon after the death of his father there, and he established there. He established himself there. But when he is coming back to Kolkata on the reconciliation conference, then he planned to revisit his own house. His own house means a house which was his own. I mean, before this partition crisis started, and I mean, and there was a sort of a feeling of alienation, because his familiar spaces got completely changed. The very familiar Park Circus, the very familiar portrait of Gandhi that was there in the house, the Kanthali Chapa tree, okay, that was in the main gate, it was cut down and replaced by a sweet shop. So all the images the familiar images that stood for house for Alam before he left the country, they were not there. Okay, so he initially thought that his return to the house, to his own house, would we would ultimately bring him to a sort of familiar space, but ultimately the return turns out to be an empty performative. Okay, it was a physical return only. Okay, a return which ultimately remained unrealized. Okay, he became nostalgic about his own house. There was multiple reminiscences, regarding the house, how his father used to sit somewhere in the house, how his father, was a very popular doctor in the locality. Okay, and even after the departure of his family to East Pakistan, how he spent some good time with the family of Ananta Sekhar, particularly with Raka. So all these things came in the form of stream of consciousness to Alam. Okay, but ultimately there was the surrender of the individual to the historical. Okay, because his individual memory of the house, his individual relationship with Raka. Okay, there was not the least importance of these individual things in in the history of the nation, in the history of the state. All right, so what Divendu Palit wants to mean, wants to communicate through this story is that the subjective idea of home is different from the objective or the political idea of the state, and there is nothing personal when we are confronted with the political. Okay, because the space of familiarity, the personal space of love, relationship, everything, they become insignificant. However common they may appear to be, but the political developments, the religious disparities, that once displaced them from their own house, it also obstructed Alam to get back to his own house really. Although he returned to his house physically, but he could not get back to his house as far as his idea of house is concerned. All right. So this it what has been explored by Divendu Palit. This idea of non-belongingness, this idea of homelessness, this idea of identity crisis, and house is the Alamson's house is certainly the central metaphor and the central character in the story, because it is around the house that everything happens. Okay, Alam reaches his old house. He realizes that his house has become an alternate, different place to stay. Because when he revisited the house, he was offered the guest room. Okay, just think of it was his own house once upon a time, and when he is coming back to the house, he is being offered a guest room. Okay, so he aspires for a sort of uh, a familiar space in the house, because the memory of the house comes into his mind, and he wants to get a house of his own. But ultimately he found that it was not a house of his own. Okay, and it belonged to somebody else, not because of the problem of somebody else, because Ananta Sekhar and Sinha, they do not didn't have any problem with Alam's presence in the house, but because of the political reality, because of the religious strife in the country. So these themes of homelessness, belonging, and the identity crisis, existential crisis that come from one sense of homelessness and rootlessness, that these have been highlighted by Divendu Palis in this story. All right. Now from this story, if you have any question, you can ask. It is not possible to read out the story in details, but What I'm trying to give you some idea about this story. What is there in the story? I mean, what are the major concerns? Who are the characters, and how significant partition texts they are? No question. So let's move to the next story. That is the final solution. And final solution, the story is there. The story explores the displacement thing involved in partition, the migration thing, the refugee crisis, and ultimately the sexual violence. Okay, it is one of the most acclaimed works of Manik Bandyopadhyay, our very own Manik Bandyopadhyay, and the plot of the story, it revolves around an impoverished family that migrates to West Bengal after the partition of Bengal, and migration turned them into distressed, homeless, nondescript among the strangers. Okay, first of all, and secondly, the story also brings out the tales of suffering, the tales of molestation, rape, sexual violence, which were quite common during the partition days, the post-partition days, I must say. Okay, and if we look at the story, then Manik Bandyopadhyay here writes about the destruction of values as well. Okay, the politics of power and sexuality in the refugee problem in Calcutta, and also the destruction of values. Okay, now many of the Hindu families who had to leave their house in East Pakistan, that is Bangladesh now, when they came to West Bengal, to save their lives, they could not find a proper place to take some shelter. Okay, and they were forced to settle in any place they could find. Okay, including the public places like railway station, because the story Final Solution starts with a description of the refugees gathered in the Sialda railway station. Okay, so the refugee crisis involved in the partition reality that the story starts with. Okay, and then we have the protagonist of the story, whose name is Mallika, a woman protagonist. She also resides. She's also a migrant. I mean, a refugee. She also resides on the railway platform. Okay, with her husband, who is disabled, Bhushan, whose name is, with her widowed sister-in-law, whose name is Asha, and their 2.5-year-old son, whose name is Khokon. Okay. Now, this very precariousness, living on a railway platform, this very precariousness, this very vulnerability, helplessness. Okay, this foregrounds the family's rootlessness and its destabilized existence. Okay, because railway platform is not ultimately a home. Okay, so the helplessness of this family, it actually subverts the idea of home, in fact. Okay, and when the pimp, the tout Pramotho, okay, he comes to Mallika with the offer of giving her shelter, giving her food. Okay, Mallika, okay, turns out to be a very brave woman. Okay, I would be Mallika actually resembles the character of there is one character by of Mahashata Devi. She is not Dolati. There is one who killed Sena Nayaka in the story. I forget the name just. Okay, so Mallika turns out to be a very, very brave woman, and she understands the risk involved in the offer, but only because of her maternal love that she becomes agree to compromise her body and self-respect. Okay, I mean, she knew that she was a pimp. He was a pimp. Pramotha was a pimp, and he would ultimately throw her into the prostitution, into the prostitution. But she had to accept that offer because there was no other way out. Okay, but when Pramotha tried to molest her, tried to, I mean, molest her, okay, then she protested, because whereas prostitution is like humiliating, but it is depersonalized. Okay, but Pramotha's violation of the body is like a personal betrayal of the trust that Mallika puts in him. Okay, and ultimately this act of betrayal on the part of Pramotha, who apparently appears to be a charitable man. Why I told that it is also a destruction story about the destruction of values, because Pramotho appears on the station, in the sort of an avatar, okay, come with the offer to help the distressed, but it was only a sort of, uh, I mean, it was only a sort of trap that Pramotho used to take the women into the prostitution. Okay, so ultimately the act of betrayal, this destruction of values of Pramotho, that breaks the boundaries of the patience of Mallika, and she strangles him to death. Okay, and the money that she takes from the dead man represents ultimately the final solution. So just look at the thing that one helpless uh, refugee woman, okay, Mallika is other in many senses. She is an helpless, homeless woman. She is a refugee in a new country. She is also a woman. But ultimately, for the sake of mother love, for the sake of maternal love, she turns out to be a very powerful woman, killing a man, murdering a man like Pramotho. So she ultimately turns out, appears to be an empowered man. Okay, empowered man, and this empowerment comes from the killing. Draupadi, yes, I got the name. Draupadi in most of the stories is also, she suffered. Senanayaka tortured her. Excessively. Okay, but ultimately, when she, and there is another story of Mahasata which I am getting reminded of. It is the hunt. Okay, where Mary Orao, she also killed the Tehsildar, and ultimately turns out to be a powerful woman. Okay, so this idea of sexual violence, the androcentric violence, and a resistance to it, okay, all these have been narrativized by Manik Bandyopadhyay in the final solution. Okay, although the story, the conclusion of the story is disturbing in a sense. It starts, it ends with a killing, but it is, the killing is important in the sense it empowers the woman. Okay, the suffered, helpless refugee woman. So Mallika, Mary Orao, Dobdi Mezen, they stand on the same platform in the sense that they suffered in the hands of the androcentric agents, and they had to retort, they had to revolt, they had to resist, and their path of resistance is ultimately the murder. Okay, so this is where this story comes into significance. Okay, the story is, contrary to the popular androcentric male discourse on partition history, it explored the feminist historiography, because excuse me, because it makes women a focus of inquiry. It makes women a subject as well as the agent in the narrative. Okay, so this is about the second story. So should I continue or end?
No, you can continue. Continue.
All right. Now, if we move to the next story, okay, the last two texts, that I'm going to deal with, I'm not going to deal with them in details, but let me give some sketches of them. Okay, the next story is Manto's canonical story, very famous, very popular, is Tobatek Singh. Okay, and it is again about a place. It is about a place, and it is also about the psychological aspect of partition. It is also about the trauma of partition. But before I tell you about this story, let me give one detail about Manto. The story was written in somewhere in 1955, and Manto left India in 1948, and he settled there in Pakistan. Okay, although it was he was unwilling to leave India, particularly Bombay. He was so particularly affiliated. I mean, he had a genuine affinity towards the landscape of Bombay, but ultimately he had to leave the country and settle there at Pakistan. But soon after Malto settled in Pakistan, he started suffering from a sense of homelessness. Okay, and because he was very popular in Bombay, he had multiple friends like Ismat Chugtai and many other. Okay, and he enjoyed their company. He enjoyed the everything that Bombay stood for. I mean, that during the time it was not Mumbai, it was Bombay. When he had to leave Bombay uh, and settle there at Pakistan, there was a sort of vacuum in Manto. Okay, and that could never be fulfilled. And throughout his life, he suffered from this hollowness after that resulted from his leaving of Mumbai. If you have watched the movie Manto by Nandita Das, this movie is particularly about this thing, Manto's leaving of Mumbai, his resettlement in Lahore, and the time, I mean the bad time he had in Manto. এই সিনেমাতে একটা দুটো দুটো কোট আমি ওই মুভি থেকে যদি বলি তাহলে টোবাটিক সিং বুঝতে আরো সুবিধা হবে। I mean, the sense of place Manto had. What I am referring to is the sense of place, the deep attachment, Manto's topophilia, the deep attachment Manto had to the city called Bombay. When Manto became ill, he became alcoholic. After there in Lahore, he became alcoholic. He became ill. Okay, then his friends from India visited him. Okay, including Ismat Chugtai, and Ismat Chugtai was a very close friend of Manto. They enjoyed something more than friendship. Okay, it was a great companionship. And when the friends visited Manto, the ill Manto, uh, then they told Manto that तू जल्दी से ठीक हो जा, हाँ? क्या चाहिए तुझे ठीक होने के लिए? तখন मानतो बोलबे जे मेरे लिए एक टुकड़ा बॉम्बे ला सकते हो. That was his sense of place. That was, the love he had for the country. Okay, he used to say that मैं चलता फिरता बॉम्बे हूँ, I'm a talking walking Mumbai. He used to say always. Okay, he always carried Mumbai within him. And when you read the story, Tobatek Singh, Bishan Singh's attachment to the place Tobatek Singh, Bishan Singh attachment to the particular geographical location, simply a fictional representation of Malto's love for the city of Bombay. Okay, Malto's love for the city of Bombay. This story, there are a number of stories. Madness is a very common trope in partition literature. Okay, because apart from the physical violence, the victims of partition, they suffered from mental or psychological violence in the forms of panic attack, in the forms of pathological neurosis, paranoia, traumatic disorder, aggressive behavior, madness. Okay, and they suffered. I mean, these sufferings came both at the individual level as well at the collective level. Okay, and in Manto's stories, a large number of characters. I mean, the characters who are underdogs from the dark margins. Okay, Manto's own words, dark margins of society. That is, I mean, they suffered. I mean, they were not civilized characters. Okay, good number of characters like Bishan Singh in Tobatek Singh, like there's one character Kasim. Okay, Kasim is a character in Sarifan. okay, the sugar apple, which is translated as. Then the in Khuda Ki Kasam there is one unnamed old woman, okay. Then in Khol, the one story by Manto, it is again a very powerful story. Open it. The rapist of Sakina, okay. In another story that is Thanda Ghost, cold flesh or cold meat, there is one character, Iswar Singh, okay. They suffer from either trauma or pathological aggression or madness, okay. So Bishan Singh is not a different character if we I mean take into consideration Manto's partition Ovia as a whole, okay. So in the present story, I mean, in Toba Singh, Bishan Singh is very much identical with his native land, as Manto was identical always with the city of Bombay. And Toba Singh, I mean, he found that Toba Singh is something that again, this in this story, Toba the place is the central character, not Bishan Singh. Okay, that is where the title of the story is very significant, because in the story, the place and the person they become the same. Okay. Now, apparently, the story opens with a description of the mental asylum, okay, the lunatics who suffer, I mean, the lunatics of different religions. There was a Sikh lunatic, there was a Muslim lunatic, there was Hindu lunatics, okay. And by giving anecdotes about this individual madman, Manto, in fact, tried to give us a picture of how the country as a whole became insane. Okay, insane during the partition. Okay, so the asylum that we have the picture of in the story, it can be looked upon as a microcosm of the outside world. Okay, it was because in the outside there was a larger asylum, okay, larger asylum full of lunatics, because people were keen on murdering, on raping, on drawing borders, okay. So it was a madness, collective form of madness, okay. And Toba Singh is just a miniature of the collective form of madness, okay. It was a time and it was a time when an insane was much saner than than so-called a sane man. Okay, so there is again the land dislocation, because Toba Singh and the Bishan Singh was forcefully being carried. He was being deported to the other country, and when he came to know that Toba Singh, the place belonged to Pakistan, then he decided to. I mean, he became reluctant to get deported, and he ultimately died on somewhere in between this no man's land. Okay, and the occasional gibberish, okay, upar the gurgur, the nonsensical utterings, okay, this seems as a kind of claptrap, but in reality, this claptrap has a meaning, because dar fatemu, the final three words of this uttering, they actually mean get away with your bloody mouth. Okay, so thinking from this perspective, we can consider that this nonsensical gibberish is a sort of critique of the partition-induced pathology, okay, that had been inflicted upon both the perpetrators and the perpetrated. Okay, so this decision of transforming the lunatics, then the displacement, okay, then the deportment and the final death of Toba Singh, Bishan Singh, they all become powerful in exploring the trauma or the psychological aspects of partition, because the story is ultimately not about an individual lunatic, it is about a collective lunacy, it is about a collective madness. Okay, it is the madness of it is a madness which a million people suffered during that time. Okay, so this is what I mean I can tell about the story in brief. And if we come to the final text that is in our syllabus, এটা একটা বাংলা কবিতা জীবনানন্দ দাশের লেখা আবার আসিব ফিরে, যেটা আমাদের সিলেবাসে যেটা আছে সেটা সুকান্ত চৌধুরীর অনুবাদ করা কবিতা আবার আসিব ফিরে, I shall return to this Bengal. Okay, this is again a poem about the speaker's sense of place. It is a lyric. Okay, it's a very powerful lyric, sense of place, because Jivananda Das was originally born in Borishal. Okay, and this village Borishal was in Bangladesh, in undivided Bengal, and he had an affinity with the exotic natural ambience of that place. Okay, in 1945 he came to Kolkata from Borishal, and he was unable to go back to this place because of the turmoil of partition was in its peak during that time. Okay, so the beauty, the scenic, sensuous, graphic beauty that have been represented, that has been represented by a collection of images in the poem. It is the beauty of Borishal that Jivananda Das was in his mind when he wrote this poem. Okay, it is the memory of his birthplace. Okay, he seems to be nostalgic because due to partition he was unable to go back to his birthplace. Okay, and the nitty-gritty details that we find about the natural beauty of the place, it simply highlighted the sufferings and the loss that happened due to partition. Okay, so the images that are drawn from the opulent, rich, rural life of undivided Bengal, they are complex with mixed metaphors, transferred epithets. Okay, they ultimately, this piling up of images, they ultimately create a sort of sensory genealogy of land, a genealogy of a land that is lost forever. Okay, and underlying these images is an intimate sensual knowledge of a land, its flora, its fauna. Okay, the different forms of nature that actually haunts the poet, even long after the partition. This is a poem which was written after the partition. Okay, and the poem is simply an exhortation to remember a land before the bloodshed. And very interestingly, the poet speaker thus here wants to be a bird to return to his land, okay, rather than a human being. Because border, border are for human beings, okay, because Das is very aware of the fact that the specificity of land, the specific land is for specific people, okay, but birds do not abide by any border. Panchi nadiya pawan ke jhoke, koi sarhad na aine roke. Okay, because Panchi nadiya pawan ke jhoke, they do not care for any man-made shadow lines. Okay, so there is this call to get back. I mean, thus created a sort of imaginary homelands, because in really, actually, he could not get back to his homeland physically. So here he created a sort of imaginary homeland to get back to his homeland through the paths of memory and nostalgia. So this song is apparently a representation of the scenic beauty of Bengal, but ultimately it underlines and outlines, in fact, the sufferings and loss that an individual suffered due to the partition. All right. So this is a sort of brief deliberation on partition literature and the text that you have in your syllabus. Hope you got tired. Thank you for bearing with me. Once again, I would like to thank Visheswar sir for giving me the opportunity to share some of my thoughts on partition literature. Now, if you have any question, feel free to ask.
Thank you, sir, for your wonderful lecture. I would request the students, if they have any question, they can ask it. They can ask to our speaker. কারো কোনো প্রশ্ন থাকলে তোমরা স্যারকে জিজ্ঞেস করো সরাসরি।
একদম নির্দ্বিধায় নির্সংকোচে
বাংলাতেও করতে পারো,
বাংলাতেও করতে পারো।
হ্যালো
হ্যাঁ,
হ্যালো স্যার।
হ্যাঁ, সোমনাথ বলো।
Sir, in partition literature, many times, oftentimes the female body becomes the location of representing the violence actually carried out during that time. So
Okay.
how far is it justified? If we look at it from a female feminist perspective, actually, how far is it justified?
Justified in the sense that they happened in reality and the partition literature is simply documented them with some addition of imaginative elements. If the representation is not justified, then how can the reality be justified? Do you think that whatever happened to women, I mean whatever meted out to women in the name of religious fanaticism, was it justified? If that was not justified, how the representation can be justified? Okay. So if you are speaking about this refinement of literature, partition was not a refined incident, a refined event. Okay. It was, I mean, a violent, crude thing to happen. And the literature must represent this crude thing. Okay. Manto have been in many of his interviews. Okay. Manto's texts were censored. They were banned because of this representing this horror, naked reality of partition. But he didn't care because he always, time and again, repeated his argument that if my work is censored, then why did partition happen? I am just sketching the reality. Okay? I am just sketching the reality. I am not to blame. People, the political armchair politicians who, I mean, did the petition thing, they are to blame, not me. I am only representing things. All right. So sometimes the
Okay.
female violence, I mean, represented, I mean, the crude violence, they appear to be crude, they appear to be harsh, but the partition reality were, I mean, harsher than what has been represented in partition literature. All right. I hope
Okay,
you have
sir.
that answer. Anything else?
Any more questions?
I think they don't have. Anyway, still, if you have any question, I mean, later, then you can write me. Okay. You can, I mean, send them to my WhatsApp. I'd be happy to answer.
So, thank you. Just a minute. So, thank you. Am I audible?
Yes, sir, you are.
Okay, thank you, Tarik, for your presentation or the talk you have uh, delivered today before the students of our college, as well as there are other participants too. I can see them, I can feel, and we are really thankful to you. Tanmay, I am really thankful to you for being here. And the students or participants from other institutions who are there, we are very thankful to you. And I thank you, Tarik, particularly because the way you have theorized the partition literature itself and how it has been a reflection of partition violence, partition the fact, the historical events that were there with partition, and why we should study partition literature, and how and where does the history of partition, the accepted historiography of partition is different from partition literature. So the way you have planned out this entire talk has been brilliant and very easy, very lucid, and clearly understandable. I hope that it has benefited our students very much. So we have one or two exchanges as well. So I thank you, those who posed questions. The questions were tricky, no doubt, but they were tricky as well as they were very suggestive of the incident itself. So if you don't have any other question, I would request Doipan to sum it up and Rahul Burua sir, our HOD, to offer thank to our speaker and to wrap up the entire thing.
Thank you, sir. I must say the lecture by Professor Tarik Ali has been an extensive one, and it has covered all the aspects of the syllabus of partition literature, which he has beautifully explained in detail in a lucid way as well as in a scholarly way. The lecture has been very insightful enough, and it has been very beneficial to our students, and we hope to invite Professor Tarik Ali again in our upcoming lecture series, either in online or in offline mode. Um, and I would now request our respected head of the department, Professor Rahul Borua, who will deliver the valedictory lecture for today's event. Rahul, are you there?
Thank you, Doipan. First of all, I would like to thank uh, Professor Tarik Ali for this wonderful and insightful lecture. I believe that our students as well as the participants uh, have learned so many things from his lecture, from this insightful lecture. And I believe that Professor Ali would be there again with us and he would deliver his lecture uh, regarding other things, other aspects of our syllabus. And I would like to thank on behalf of our college, that is Government General Degree College, Nalgore, for this beautiful lecture. And thank you all for participating here in this lecture series. With this, I would like to sum up our uh,